In the sprawling domains of the Duchy of Rothwell, where verdant hills stretched as far as the eye could see, the year 1784 had brought a prosperity that starkly contrasted with the misery plaguing neighboring lands. Young Duke Alexandre of Rothwell, at 28, governed with the same aristocratic firmness as his ancestors, though his heart often stirred with unease at the disparities he witnessed between his castle walls and the wretched hovels dotting his estates. One October morning, as the first golden sunbeams pierced the ornate stained glass windows of his study, Alexandre received the usual reports from his administrators. The figures were impressive. Harvests had been abundant, taxes collected punctually, and the ducal coffers had never been so full. Yet, a shadow of disquiet lingered in his mind when Sir Edmund Blackthorne, his loyal butler for over 2 decades, presented him with a peculiar report. Sir Edmund, with the deference only decades of aristocratic service could mold, informed Alexandre of certain irregularities observed on the properties of their more prosperous neighbors. It seemed a mysterious figure had been infiltrating grand mansions during balls and receptions, absconding with jewels and objects of considerable value. Alexandre lifted his gaze from the parchments, his aristocratic fingers tapping lightly on the English oak desk that had belonged to his great-grandfather. The news should not have surprised him. Times were turbulent, and social unrest grew like a distant storm inexorably approaching. Yet something in the nature of these thefts piqued his curiosity. He asked Sir Edmund for more details about these irregularities, wondering what kind of thief would dare infiltrate the salons of high society. The butler discreetly adjusted his posture, a habit Alexandre recognized as a sign that intriguing information was forthcoming. Sir Edmund explained that according to the reports, it was a lady, an elegant figure who frequented social events with natural ease, carrying herself like a true aristocrat. Lord Pemberton, he recounted, swore she had conversed with him for nearly an hour about philosophy and literature before discovering the next day that his wife had lost an emerald necklace valued at £500. Alexandre leaned forward slightly, genuinely intrigued. A thief who moved in aristocratic circles with such poise was no common criminal. She was someone who deeply understood the codes and protocols of the nobility. Sir Edmund continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially, to reveal the most curious detail. Part of these stolen riches had appeared among the needy in nearby villages. Entire families facing starvation suddenly received gold coins, and abandoned orphans found bread and clothes at their doors. The young duke remained silent for long moments, contemplating the implications of that information. In an era where aristocratic charity followed rigid ceremonial protocols, someone was redistributing wealth directly and effectively, circumventing all established social conventions. His thoughts were interrupted by a messenger bearing an elaborately decorated invitation. Lady Margaret Ashford, one of the region's most prominent hostesses, invited him to a ball, promising to gather the cream of the local aristocracy. Alexandre observed the heavy, perfumed paper, adorned with blue silk ribbons, and an idea began to form in his mind. He instructed Sir Edmund to prepare his finest attire for Lady Ashford's ball, believing the time had come to personally meet this mysterious benefactress. The butler bowed respectfully, though Alexandre could perceive a hint of concern in his experienced eyes. After all, dukes did not typically involve themselves directly in the capture of criminals, however noble their motivations. As Sir Edmund withdrew to make preparations, Alexandre remained by the window, watching the peasants working on his lands. The rigid hierarchy that governed his existence began to seem simultaneously natural and profoundly unsettling, as if he were awakening for the first time to contradictions that had always been before his eyes. Ashford Manor rose majestically against the night sky, its hundreds of windows radiating golden light that spread across the meticulously manicured gardens. As the ducal carriage passed through the ornate gates, Alexandre felt that familiar mix of boredom and social obligation accompanying such events. However, on that particular night, a different expectation pulsed in his chest. Lady Margaret Ashford received him with the pomp due to his title, her plumes and jewels glittering under the crystal chandeliers. Alexandre greeted her with the aristocratic courtesy instilled in him since childhood, but his eyes discreetly scanned the ballroom, observing each lady present with new attention. Lady Ashford, with a smile blending deference and social calculation, expressed her pleasure in introducing him to some young ladies who had recently arrived in their region, specifically mentioning Lady Catherine de Montclair, who honored them with her presence directly from London. Alexandra turned in the indicated direction and felt as if time hesitated for an instant. The woman approaching possessed an elegance that transcended the ornaments and fine fabrics adorning the others. Her brown hair was arranged in an elaborate coiffure that highlighted the delicacy of her features, but it was her eyes, deep, intelligent green, that immediately captured his attention. Lady Catherine performed a perfect curtsy, neither excessively humble nor insufficiently respectful for his ducal title. When she raised her eyes to meet his, Alexandra perceived a vivacity and intelligence he rarely encountered in aristocratic salons. She addressed him, her voice carrying a melodious timbre that seemed natural, devoid of the affected artifices characterizing many society ladies. During their subsequent conversation, Alexandra found himself genuinely captivated. Lady Catherine demonstrated an impressive knowledge of literature, philosophy, and even political matters that many women of her class carefully avoided. She spoke of Voltaire and Rousseau with familiarity, discussed the implications of recent tensions in France with insight, and yet maintained all the composure and elegance expected of a lady of good family. Alexandra confessed to her, as they walked through the ballroom after a country dance, that it was rare to find someone who shared a genuine interest in the issues shaping their times, noting that most preferred to limit conversations to social gossip and weather comments. She smiled, and Alexandra noticed how that smile reached her eyes in a way that seemed completely sincere. She believed, she told him, that they lived in an era where the ignorance of the privileged classes could become dangerously costly, suggesting that when the people suffered while the aristocracy danced, a chasm was created that could eventually swallow everyone. The observation was bold, almost improper for a lady at a social event. However, the way Lady Catherine expressed it, with conviction but without aggression, only intensified Alexandra's fascination. As the night progressed, he found himself constantly seeking her company, neglecting other guests in a manner that might be considered socially inappropriate. Lady Catherine seemed equally interested in their conversation, asking perceptive questions about the administration of his estates and demonstrating genuine concern for the well-being of his subjects. It was during a moment when they retreated to the balcony, seeking fresh air away from the heat of the salons, that Alexandra decided to make a seemingly casual observation. He mentioned that there had been interesting reports in the region, noting that a charitable soul seemed to be redistributing wealth among the needy in a rather creative way, carefully observing her reaction. For a fleeting instant, Alexandra thought he perceived something, a flicker of tension perhaps, or an almost imperceptible change in her expression. However, Lady Catherine responded with apparent tranquility. She found the story fascinating, she said, especially in times when the disparity between rich and poor became so glaring, suggesting it was perhaps natural for figures to emerge willing to take direct action. She acknowledged that such actions might be technically criminal, but found it difficult not to admire the motivation behind them. Her answer was skillfully neutral, but Alexandra realized she had neither denied knowledge of the events nor expressed genuine surprise. His suspicion strengthened, but along with it grew an admiration that surprised him. As the night drew to a close and Alexandra prepared to depart, Lady Catherine casually mentioned she would be visiting Lord Pemberton's library the following afternoon, having heard of a rare collection of philosophical manuscripts there. Upon returning to his castle in the early hours of the morning, Alexandra found himself unable to dismiss from his mind those intelligent green eyes and the stimulating conversation they had shared. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely interested in someone who transcended the conventional expectations of his social class. He did not yet know that that night marked the beginning of a transformation that would question everything he had accepted about honor, duty, and the moral limits of his aristocratic privilege. Lord Pemberton's library, with its oak shelves stretching from floor to vaulted ceiling, remained steeped in the quiet characteristic of knowledge repositories. Alexandra had arrived seemingly by chance, claiming a sudden interest in the same philosophical manuscripts that had attracted Lady Catherine, though his true motivation was to observe her more closely in a less formal setting. He found her engrossed in a volume by Locke, her delicate fingers tracing the lines of the text with a concentration that seemed genuine. The golden light filtering through the colored panes created a soft halo around her hair, and Alexandre felt again that inexplicable disturbance her presence provoked. He greeted Lady Catherine, approaching with the natural ease that only years of aristocratic education could confer, remarking on the pleasant coincidence of finding her there. She looked up, and Alexandre again noted that lively intelligence that so intrigued him. She responded with a smile that seemed to carry secrets, suggesting that great minds thought alike, and finding the treatise on property and its moral limits particularly fascinating. The choice of text was not casual, Alexandre realized. Locke had written extensively on the natural rights and moral obligations of those with wealth toward the destitute. It was almost as if she were testing his political convictions. For the next hour, they engaged in a philosophical discussion that transcended any social conversation Alexandre had ever experienced. Lady Catherine demonstrated a deep understanding not only of the texts, but of the practical implications of the ideas they discussed. When she mentioned Rousseau's theories on social inequality, her eyes shone with a passion Alexandre found simultaneously attractive and unsettling. It was then that Lord Pemberton burst into the library in a state of evident agitation. His face was flushed, and his hands trembled slightly as he addressed Alexandre directly. Lord Pemberton, his voice laden with aristocratic indignation, reported an audacious crime perpetrated in his own home during the previous night's ball. His wife, he explained, had discovered that morning that her most valuable jewels had disappeared from her personal safe. Alexandre felt a chill run down his spine. Discreetly, he observed Lady Catherine, who had turned to listen to the conversation with an expression of polite interest that revealed nothing beyond appropriate social courtesy. Alexandre, maintaining a tone of appropriate concern, inquired about the type of jewels that had been stolen. Lord Pemberton specified a complete set of Burmese rubies that had belonged to his mother-in-law, valued at over £1,000, including necklaces, earrings, and a tiara. Pieces his family had preserved for generations. The most disconcerting aspect, he added, was that only someone with intimate knowledge of the house could have located the secret safe where they were kept. Lady Catherine approached the two men, her expression showing appropriate compassion in the face of such a violation. She expressed her sympathy for the terrible event, hoping Lord Pemberton's wife was not excessively distressed, noting that crimes of that nature were particularly disturbing when they occurred in one's own home. Lord Pemberton, his agitation growing, continued by revealing something even more bizarre. Part of the jewels had been found that morning, distributed among the poorest families in the nearby village. Women who barely had proper clothes appeared wearing ruby earrings, and orphan children were seen playing with gold chains. Alexandre watched Lady Catherine's face intently as this information was revealed. For a fleeting moment, he thought he perceived a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes, quickly masked by an expression of appropriate surprise. She found it an extraordinary story, she said, remarking that their thief seemed to possess unusual altruistic motivations. While one certainly could not approve of criminal methods, she found it difficult not to feel a certain sympathy for the intentions behind such actions. Her choice of words was careful, but Alexandre perceived the subtle approval she conveyed. At that moment, his suspicion crystallized into almost absolute certainty. Lady Catherine de Montclair was the mysterious redistributor of wealth who had captured his imagination. Lord Pemberton, turning to Alexandre with evident expectation, stated that as the most prestigious nobleman in the region, they expected him to take measures to capture this criminal, emphasizing that such violations of private property could not be allowed to continue, regardless of the supposedly noble motivations behind them. Alexandre found himself in an impossible position. As a duke, he had a moral and legal obligation to support the capture of any criminal operating on his lands. However, looking at Lady Catherine, if that was indeed her name, he felt a growing admiration for someone who had found a direct and effective way to alleviate the suffering of the needy. He assured Lord Pemberton that he would certainly take appropriate measures, aware that his words carried multiple possible interpretations, adding that the matter required careful and delicate investigation. As they said their goodbyes at the entrance of Pemberton Manor, Lady Catherine briefly held Alexandre's gaze, and he perceived a silent question there. It was as if she were assessing whether he represented a threat or a potential ally. That night, as he contemplated the dancing flames in his private fireplace, Alexandre understood that his orderly and predictable life had come to an end. For the first time, he faced a dilemma that directly pitted his aristocratic duties against the moral convictions growing in his heart. The choice he would make in the coming weeks would define not only his future, but the kind of man he truly was behind the title he carried. The days following the incident in Lord Pemberton's library brought Alexandre a restlessness he had not experienced since his youth. His mornings, once dedicated to the methodical administration of his estates, were now interrupted by recurring thoughts of Lady Catherine and the growing certainty of her secret identity. Sir Edmund, with the perceptiveness only decades of aristocratic service could develop, noticed the change in his master's behavior during morning breakfast. He observed that his grace seemed preoccupied, asking if the estate matters were causing any particular unease. Alexandre looked up from the papers he had pretended to read, aware that Sir Edmund knew his habits well enough to perceive when something troubled him. He admitted to Sir Edmund that he had been reflecting on the responsibilities his title imposed on them, questioning whether they had adequately fulfilled their duties to those who depended on their protection. The butler slightly raised his eyebrows, recognizing that philosophical morning discussions were unusual for Alexandre's habitually practical temperament. Sir Edmund, with due respect, offered his observation that their administration had been consistently just and generous, noting that the taxes they collected were proportionally lower than those of neighboring duchies, and their assistance to the needy during harsh winters was well documented. Alexandre agreed, rising and walking towards the windows overlooking the ducal gardens, but wondered if their formal and ceremonial charity truly reached those most in need, suggesting there might be more direct and effective ways to alleviate the suffering of the destitute. Sir Edmund remained silent for a moment, recognizing the delicate ground the conversation had reached. He then asked if His Grace was referring to the recent redistributive events that had occurred in the region. Alexandre turned to face him, admiring as always his butler's ability to understand unverbalized subtleties. He stated his need to personally investigate these events, instructing Sir Edmund to arrange a discreet meeting with some of the beneficiaries of these mysterious distributions, as he wished to better understand how these riches had reached them. During the afternoon, Alexandre rode through the poorer villages of his domains, something he rarely did without a formal retinue. Dressed simply but still unmistakably aristocratically, he visited families he had been informed had received mysterious gifts. The first was Martha Whitmore, a widow raising 3 small children in a hovel that barely offered protection from the wind. When Alexandre identified himself, she received him with a mixture of terror and reverence that made him feel profoundly uncomfortable. She insisted she had done nothing wrong, her trembling hands clutching a patched shawl, swearing the coins had appeared at her door, and she did not know where they came from. Alexandre gently reassured her that he was not there to accuse her of anything, and gradually managed to extract the details of how the gold coins had appeared. Her description of the figure she briefly saw in the darkness, an elegant lady who moved with silent grace, only confirmed his suspicions. Similar visits to other families produced consistent accounts. A mysterious benefactress had distributed not only money, but also quality clothing, nutritious food, and even expensive medicines. Even more impressive was the precision with which she had identified the specific needs of each family. Upon returning to the castle at the end of the afternoon, Alexandre found a note waiting for him. The paper was of refined quality, and the handwriting demonstrated aristocratic education. The message was brief, but full of meaning. It suggested that if His Grace truly wished to understand the redistribution of wealth, it might be profitable to observe needs firsthand during a night walk through the poorer districts of Millbrook, adding that a knowledgeable guide would be available at 10 o'clock that night near St. Thomas's Church. There was no signature, but Alexandre did not need one. The invitation was simultaneously a challenge and an invitation for him to demonstrate whether his philosophical reflections would translate into practical action. That night, Alexandre discreetly left the castle, informing only Sir Edmund that he was conducting a private inspection of the properties. He dressed simply, avoiding any adornment that might immediately reveal his aristocratic identity. St. Thomas's Church stood dark against the night sky when he arrived at the agreed location. For a few minutes, he remained alone in the darkness, questioning the wisdom of his decision. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows near the cemetery. Lady Catherine approached with the same elegance she displayed in aristocratic salons, but now she wore dark, practical clothes that allowed her to move with freedom and discretion. She greeted His Grace, her voice carrying a note of respectful challenge, expressing her hope that he was prepared to see aspects of his domains that might not be visible from his castle windows. Alexandre inclined his head, feeling a mixture of apprehension and excitement he had not experienced in years. He told Lady Catherine, if that was indeed her name, that he was prepared to learn whatever she was willing to teach him. She smiled, and even in the dim light, he could perceive it was a different smile from those she displayed at social events. More genuine, more dangerous. She urged him to follow, noting there was much to see, and the night was brief. As they walked together through the narrow, dimly lit streets of Millbrook, Alexandre understood that he was crossing a line that separated not only his aristocratic world from the needy, but also the man he had been from the man he could become. The streets of Millbrook revealed a reality to Alexandre that his ceremonial visits had never exposed. Lady Catherine silently led him through narrow alleys where entire families huddled in rooms barely deserving of the name. The stench of disease and deprivation mingled with the cold night air, creating an atmosphere that brutally contrasted with the perfumed salons that constituted his usual world. She stopped before a dilapidated door, from which low moans emanated, explaining that it was the Harrison family. The father, she recounted, had lost his right arm in an accident while working on the new wing of Pemberton Manor, without compensation, naturally. The mother, she continued, sewed late into the night to earn a few pennies, but it was not enough to feed 4 children, and buy the medicine her husband needed. Alexandre peered through the fogged window and saw a scene that etched itself permanently into his memory. An exhausted woman bent over sewing by the light of a single candle, while her husband coughed violently in a dark corner of the room. He asked, his voice lower than he intended, how much it would cost to provide them with adequate relief. She answered without hesitation that it would be less than Lord Pemberton spent on French wine during a single reception, but stressed that traditional aristocratic charity would never reach them. First, she explained, they would need to formally beg, then wait for their request to be considered by committees, and finally receive an amount determined by bureaucracies that had never witnessed their real suffering. The bitterness in her voice was evident, and Alexandre realized she spoke from personal experience with the inadequate mechanisms of aristocratic philanthropy. They continued their nocturnal journey, and each stop revealed new layers of misery existing just a few miles from his comfortable castle. Orphans sleeping in abandoned stables, elderly people choosing between buying food or fuel to keep warm, entire families evicted for failing to pay rents that consumed more than half their incomes. Alexandre asked how she obtained such precise information about each situation as they watched a child no older than 7 caring for even younger siblings. She responded that she had lived among them, and for the first time, her mask of aristocratic elegance seemed to falter slightly. She had intimately known what it meant to choose between dignity and survival before acquiring her current position. Alexandre turned to study her profile in the darkness, understanding that he was facing someone whose personal history was far more complex than he had imagined. It was then that they heard approaching voices, guards on their night rounds. Lady Catherine immediately pulled Alexandre into the shadows of a side alley, pressing herself against him in a narrow space between 2 buildings. The subtle perfume she wore mingled with the scent of poverty permeating the place, creating an unexpected intimacy that made Alexandre's heart race. She whispered that if they were discovered together there, both would face serious consequences. His Grace, she explained, would be questioned about why he wandered the poor streets in the early hours, and she would face much more serious accusations. They remained motionless until the voices faded, but Alexandre found himself reluctant to move away once the danger passed. In that moment of forced proximity, he recognized that his fascination with Lady Catherine had evolved into something deeper and more dangerous. He asked why she did it, suggesting there were certainly less risky ways to help the needy. She looked at him directly, and even in the darkness, he could perceive the intensity in her eyes. She explained that she had witnessed how aristocratic charity was, often a spectacle intended to appease guilty consciences, without producing real change, noting that while they organized charity balls and discussed philosophy about social inequality, children starved miles from their banquets. The accusation was direct and painful, and Alexandre recognized its fundamental truth. He then asked, surprising himself with his own question, what if he wanted to do something more effective, to go beyond traditional aristocratic conventions? Lady Catherine studied him for a long moment, as if assessing his sincerity. She replied that it would depend on how far His Grace would be willing to go, as real assistance to the destitute often required methods that aristocratic society would consider inappropriate. Alexandre understood that she was offering him a choice that would define not only his future, but his very identity. He could return to the comfort of his castle and pretend that night had never happened. Or he could take a step that would irrevocably commit him to a path challenging everything he had accepted about his role in society. He finally asked if she would be willing to accept a partner in her unconventional philanthropic activities if he were allowed to participate in her efforts. The smile she gave him was simultaneously triumphant and melancholic, as if she was pleased with his answer, but aware of the complications it would bring. She told His Grace that she believed they had just formed a very dangerous alliance. As they silently returned through the dark streets towards the castle, Alexandre knew he had crossed a line that could no longer be uncrossed. For the first time in his life, he had consciously chosen a path that put him in direct conflict with the expectations of his social class. The weight of his title had never seemed simultaneously so oppressive and so irrelevant. The weeks following his alliance with Lady Catherine brought Alexandre a transformation he himself barely recognized. His mornings continued to be dedicated to traditional ducal responsibilities, but his nights now belonged to a parallel world of clandestine wealth redistribution that defied all aristocratic conventions he had known. Lady Catherine proved to be a surprisingly effective mentor in the discreet methods of direct philanthropy. She had developed an information network that included disgruntled servants, sympathetic merchants, and even minor members of the aristocracy who secretly supported her efforts. Alexandre found himself fascinated not only by her compassion, but by the strategic intelligence with which she operated. She explained, during one of their nocturnal meetings as they planned their next operation, that the key was to understand that effective charity required more than good intentions. It demanded detailed knowledge of specific needs, precise timing, and above all, absolute discretion. They were gathered in the abandoned library of a ruined mansion. She had transformed into an improvised headquarters. Maps of the region covered an antique table, marked with locations of needy families and properties of potential targets. Alexandre watched her work, with an admiration that grew daily, noting how her aristocratic elegance transformed into practical efficiency when she dedicated herself to her true purposes. She informed him that his next contribution would come from Sir Reginald Blackwood's rare coin collection, indicating a point on the map. He had just acquired pieces valued at over £2,000 to impress visitors, she explained, while the workers in his textile factories received subsistence wages and faced dangerous conditions. Alexandre studied the details she had compiled about Sir Reginald, a man he knew superficially from social circles, but whose corporate cruelty now fully revealed itself. He asked how she had obtained such detailed information about his personal finances, impressed by the data's precision. She replied that his housekeeper had lost a young daughter, due to a lack of adequate medical care because Sir Reginald refused to increase her wages, adding that the housekeeper had been very cooperative in providing information about her employer's habits and possessions. At that moment, Alexandre fully understood the extent of the operation Lady Catherine had built. It was not simply a woman acting alone out of altruistic impulses, but an organized network of people who had been wronged by the aristocracy and now sought a form of justice that traditional legal systems would never provide. He carefully asked if she had ever considered that if her activities were discovered, the consequences could be extreme for everyone involved. She stopped examining the maps and looked at him directly, and Alexandre saw in her eyes a determination that was simultaneously admirable and alarming. She told His Grace that when one witnessed a child starve while aristocrats wasted food at elaborate banquets, personal consequences became irrelevant. The only question that mattered, she asserted, was whether one could live with oneself knowing they had the power to prevent such suffering and chose not to act. The passion in her voice resonated deeply with Alexandre, who felt his own convictions solidifying irreversibly. Throughout his life, he had passively accepted social disparities as a natural order, but now he understood that his privileged position granted him not only rights, but moral responsibilities he had neglected. He declared his intention to participate in this operation, surprising himself with the firmness of his own decision, but insisted on sharing the risks equally, stating that if she faced dangers to help the needy, he could not remain safe behind his title. The smile Lady Catherine gave him at that moment was different from any expression he had seen on her face. It was a smile of genuine approval, mixed with something that could be considered pride or even affection. She warned His Grace that once they participated together in this operation, he would no longer be able to feign ignorance about her methods and would become as guilty as she in the eyes of the law. Alexandre nodded gravely, fully understanding the implications of his choice, stating his readiness to accept that responsibility. Preparations for the operation at Blackwood Manor required a week of meticulous planning. Lady Catherine demonstrated impressive knowledge of household security, servants' movement patterns, and even Sir Reginald's personal habits. Alexandre contributed information about social events that would keep the owner occupied elsewhere during strategic moments. During this period of intense collaboration, Alexandre found himself spending more time in Lady Catherine's company than he ever had with anyone else. Their conversations evolved from strategic discussions to more personal exchanges, and he gradually began to understand the complexity of the woman behind the aristocratic mask. One night, as they finalized the last details of their operation, she casually mentioned her true origin. She revealed her real name was Catherine Ashworth, explaining that her father had been a respectable merchant until Sir Pemberton and his associates ruined him through dishonest business practices. He died in a debtor's prison, she continued, and her mother wasted away from grief. She had learned to move in aristocratic circles out of necessity, not by birth. The revelation explained much about her social acumen and personal motivation, but also highlighted for Alexandre how different the world from which she truly came was. He gently inquired about her ultimate goal, beyond helping specific families, asking if she had a broader plan. Catherine finally looked up to meet his eyes, and Alexandre saw a vulnerability she rarely allowed to show. She hoped to create a system where justice did not depend on aristocratic whims, where the needy could receive help based on their real needs, not on their ability to beg properly or impress charity committees. It was a radical vision that fundamentally challenged the social structure from which Alexandre was a direct beneficiary. However, the more time he spent in her company, the more convinced he became that her ideas were not only morally superior, but practically necessary. That night, as they said their goodbyes to return to their respective lodgings, Alexandre briefly held her hand, a gesture that transcended appropriate social protocols. He told Catherine, using her true name for the first time, that he wanted her to know that regardless of the consequences, he did not regret joining her in this endeavor. The way she squeezed his hand in response conveyed more than any words could express. At that moment, Alexandre understood that their alliance had evolved into something neither politics nor philanthropy could fully explain. Blackwood Manor stood imposing against the night sky as Alexandre and Catherine approached silently through the meticulously manicured gardens. The operation they had planned meticulously for weeks was about to be executed, but a different tension hung in the air. Not just the natural nervousness of their illegal activity, but the growing awareness that they were irrevocably crossing a line that would transform them. Sir Reginald, as Catherine had predicted, was attending an elaborate dinner at Ashford Manor, which would extend into the early hours of the morning. His servants followed predictable routines, and the allied housekeeper had arranged for certain doors to remain accidentally unlocked. Catherine whispered a reminder as they awaited the precise moment to act. The rare coins were in a hidden safe behind his father's portrait in the library. She had the combination, but they needed exactly 15 minutes to enter, locate the most valuable pieces, and leave without obvious traces. Alexandre nodded, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension he had never experienced in his orderly, aristocratic life. He wore dark clothes Catherine had provided, and for the first time in his adult existence, he moved without the automatic protection his ducal title normally afforded. They entered the mansion through a side entrance, and Alexandre found himself impressed by Catherine's silent dexterity as she navigated the dark corridors. Her every movement demonstrated considerable practice, reminding him that this was not her first operation of such a nature. Sir Reginald's library rivaled any aristocratic collection in the region, But Alexandra now saw it with different eyes. Each costly volume represented resources that could have fed needy families for months, while they remained there as rarely consulted symbols of status. Catherine quickly located the indicated portrait and revealed the hidden mechanism Alexandra would never have discovered. The safe contained not only the rare coin collection, but also documents she quickly examined by the light of a small lantern. She stated, her voice filled with contained indignation, that these papers documented the wages paid to the workers in his factories, noting that some men received less in an entire month than Sir Reginald spent on a single commemorative Roman coin. Alexandra looked over her shoulder, seeing figures that revealed a systematic exploitation that made Sir Reginald's ostentatious wealth even more obscene. He impulsively told her to take the documents as well, reasoning that if they were going to redistribute his wealth, the workers should know exactly how much of their labor was required to acquire it. Catherine looked at him with surprise, but quickly placed the papers with the selected coins. They were about to leave when they heard approaching footsteps in the corridor, much earlier than any predicted schedule indicated. Catherine immediately recognized the gravity of their situation, whispering that Sir Reginald had returned unexpectedly, suggesting the dinner must have ended early, or he might have suspected something. Alexandre felt the initial panic give way to an iron determination. He would not allow Catherine to face the consequences of being discovered alone. He asked if there was another way out, already moving towards the library windows. She confirmed there was, but it required scaling the outer wall and crossing the main garden, acknowledging it was risky, but their only option. The footsteps were approaching rapidly, accompanied by voices indicating that Sir Reginald was not alone. Catherine skillfully opened one of the high library windows, and Alexandra understood that she had planned this escape route from the beginning. He offered her support to reach the outer cornice, urging her to go first. Catherine firmly refused, stating that if they were discovered, he had a title that could protect him, while she had no such protection. It was a practical observation, but Alexandra refused to accept the logic that would put her in greater danger. He declared with a firmness that surprised them both that they would go together, or not at all. They managed to escape through the window moments before the library door opened, but their descent down the outer wall was observed by a night gardener, who immediately raised an alarm. As they ran through the gardens towards the protection of the nearby forest, Alexandra heard Sir Reginald shouting orders for riders to be sent in pursuit. Catherine, as they temporarily took refuge in a dense thicket, warned that they would organize searches throughout the region, and his participation would inevitably be discovered. Alexandra looked at her through the darkness, understanding that the moment for a definitive choice had arrived. He could try to minimize his involvement, claiming he had been misled or coerced, thus preserving his social position. Or he could fully accept the consequences of his actions and face the scandal that would surely follow. Alexandra, holding her hands firmly, told Catherine that he regretted nothing of what they had done that night, stating that if they faced consequences, they would face them together. She studied his face in the dim light, searching for signs of doubt or regret that she did not find. She asked if he understood that this would mean the end of his life as he knew it, noting that dukes did not survive robbery scandals, regardless of their motivations. Alexandra replied, surprising himself with the conviction in his own voice, that perhaps it was time to discover who he was beyond his title. At that moment, sheltered in the dark forest as the sounds of pursuit drew closer, both understood that they had crossed a line that had irrevocably transformed them. They were no longer simply a duke and an altruistic thief, but partners in an endeavor that challenged the very foundations of the society from which they had emerged. The test of his crown had arrived, and Alexandra found he was willing to renounce it for principles he had only recently learned to value above privileges he once considered his natural right. The makeshift refuge Catherine had established in an abandoned cabin deep within the ducal forest became the headquarters for what both recognized would be their last operation. For 3 days, they had remained hidden, while Sir Reginald's searches systematically scoured the region. But Alexandra knew that his prolonged absence from the castle would soon arouse suspicions he could not adequately explain. Catherine, on the morning of the 4th day, organizing the documents and coins they had recovered from the Blackwood operation, stated that they would discover their participation, and the question was no longer if they would be exposed, but how they chose to face that exposure. Alexandra watched her work, noting how even in those precarious circumstances, she maintained the elegance and determination that had fascinated him from the beginning. Her hair was less elaborately arranged, her clothes showed signs of time spent in the forest, but her dignity remained intact. He then proposed, rising from the rudimentary chair where he had spent the night planning, that instead of passively awaiting their capture, they should take the initiative. He suggested publicly confessing his involvement in their activities and taking full responsibility. Catherine abruptly stopped her activities and looked at him with a mixture of admiration and horror. She addressed him by his personal name, Alexandre, stating that he did not fully understand what he was suggesting. Ducal confessions of criminal activities, she explained, did not simply result in social censure. He would face imprisonment, total loss of title and property, and possibly even more severe consequences. He countered that she would face even worse consequences if captured, adding that at least his title provided him with some protection, even in compromising circumstances, a protection she did not possess. Catherine walked to the small cabin window, contemplating the forest that had protected them, but could not hide them indefinitely. She finally suggested a third option, her voice tinged with a melancholy Alexandre had not heard before. They could disappear completely, leave England, travel to the continent or even the American colonies, and start completely anew, far from titles and social expectations. The suggestion hung between them, as a possibility simultaneously attractive and terrifying. Alexandre imagined a life where he could simply be a man, not a duke, free from aristocratic obligations, but also devoid of all the securities and identities he had known since birth. He asked if she would do it, if she would completely abandon her mission to help the needy there. She replied, turning to face him directly, that for him, she would consider abandoning almost anything. The confession carried an emotional weight that transcended all the practical discussions they had shared. At that moment, Alexandre understood that what had grown between them was deeper than mutual admiration or strategic alliance. It was a love that had blossomed in impossible circumstances and now faced tests that could destroy it. Alexandre, approaching her and taking her hands, told Catherine that if they fled together, they would be saving their lives, but abandoning all those who depended on the help she had provided. They would be choosing their personal happiness over the well-being of hundreds of needy families. She closed her eyes for a moment, and Alexandre saw the conflict unfolding in her mind. The desire for self-preservation, battling against the sense of responsibility that had motivated her throughout all those months. She finally asked what he proposed. Alexandre had spent the entire previous night considering exactly that question, and a strategy had crystallized in his mind. Risky, but potentially capable of protecting both Catherine and the aid network she had built. He proposed publicly confessing, taking full responsibility, and claiming she was an innocent victim he had manipulated. His title, he reasoned, would provide him with a public audience, and he would use that audience to explain their motivations. If he could make society understand why they acted as they did, perhaps they could transform their scandal into a catalyst for systemic change. Catherine studied his face, searching for signs of doubt or hesitation. She asked what if his confession did not produce the public sympathy he hoped for, and if he was simply seen as an unbalanced aristocrat who betrayed his own class. Alexandre replied that then at least he would have spoken the truth publicly, and she would be free to continue her work under a new identity, far from any association with him. It was a plan that required considerable sacrifice on his part, but Alexandre found himself at peace with that prospect. For the first time in his life, he was consciously choosing a path based on moral convictions rather than social conveniences. Catherine, after a long silence, stated a condition. If he was going to sacrifice himself for their principles, then they would undertake one last operation together, one that would be impossible to ignore, and would make clear to all of society exactly why they acted as they did. He asked what kind of operation. Catherine smiled, and Alexandre recognized in that smile the same dangerous determination that had attracted him from the beginning. She proposed organizing a redistribution so dramatic and so publicly visible that it would force the entire regional aristocracy to directly confront the disparities they preferred to ignore. As they elaborated the details of their final strategy, Alexandre understood that they were planning not just an operation, but a declaration that would define how they would be remembered by history. It would be a fitting end to their impossible partnership. A duke and a revolutionary united in a cause that transcended their origins and challenged the very structures of the society that had created them. The night of the grand annual ball, traditionally held at Ashford Manor to celebrate the harvest season, became the chosen stage for what Catherine and Alexandra had determined would be their final declaration. All the local aristocracy would be present, flaunting their most ostentatious riches in a display of prosperity that would perfectly contrast with what they intended to reveal. Alexandre arrived at the event in his official ducal carriage, wearing his finest gala attire and bearing the insignia of his title. To all observers, he simply appeared to be the young duke fulfilling his usual social obligations. No one could suspect that he carried with him detailed documents about the exploitative practices of each family present, meticulously compiled by Catherine during months of careful investigation. Catherine, for her part, had infiltrated among the servants attending the event, using contacts she had developed among the discontented working class. Dressed appropriately for her temporary role, she moved silently through the halls, strategically placing small packages containing both documentary evidence and symbolic redistributions that would be discovered throughout the night. The culminating moment was carefully orchestrated to occur during the traditional toast that marked the event's climax. Alexandra waited for Lord Ashford to conclude his pompous remarks about the region's prosperity before rising and requesting permission to address those present. He began by addressing his esteemed colleagues of the aristocracy, his voice carrying a gravity that immediately captured everyone's attention, stating his desire to share discoveries that had profoundly transformed his understanding of their responsibilities to those who depended on their administration. A murmur of curiosity swept through the ballroom. Alexandre was known for his brief and conventional speeches at social events, and his solemn demeanor indicated that something unusual was about to occur. He continued, drawing documents from his frock coat, to reveal that over the past months, he had conducted a personal investigation into the living conditions of workers on their properties and businesses. What he discovered, he asserted, should shame all of them who professed Christian and noble values. He then began to read specific data on wages, working conditions, and exploitative practices, mentioning names and figures that made several guests visibly uncomfortable. Lord Pemberton attempted to interrupt, claiming such matters were inappropriate for a social event, but Alexandra continued undisturbed. He added, his voice growing in intensity, that it was even more disturbing to discover that some of them spent on a single social reception, the equivalent of the annual wages of dozens of working families. Sir Reginald, for example, he pointed out, paid £1,200 for a collection of decorative coins, while the children of his textile workers faced chronic malnutrition. Sir Reginald rose abruptly, his face flushed with indignation. He declared that he would not allow his legitimate business practices to be slandered in a social setting, demanding an immediate end to these unfounded accusations. Alexandra retorted, holding up a stack of papers, asking if they were unfounded, and stating that these documents, obtained from his own personal files, detailed precisely every transaction he had mentioned. The recognition that Alexandre had access to confidential information caused considerable agitation among those present. Several guests began to question how he had obtained such documents, and the atmosphere of the event quickly transformed from celebratory to confrontational. It was at that moment that Catherine made her dramatic appearance. Emerging from the service corridors, now dressed in an elegant evening gown she had strategically hidden, she entered the main ballroom carrying a silver tray that contained not refreshments, but jewels and valuables that the guests quickly recognized as their own property. She addressed the ladies and gentlemen, her voice clear and fearless echoing through the silent ballroom, asking to return some properties they had inadvertently lost during recent social events. The revelation that Lady Catherine de Montclair was the mysterious thief who had terrorized the regional aristocracy for months caused an uproar that threatened to turn into pandemonium. Several men rose, some demanding her immediate arrest, others shouting accusations of conspiracy against Alexandre. Alexandre shouted for silence, his ducal voice cutting through the tumult. He declared that Lady Catherine had acted under his direction and with his complete approval, stating that if they wished to level criminal accusations, they should direct them at him. Catherine approached him, and together they faced the crowd of enraged aristocrats who now surrounded them. Alexandra noticed how she maintained her dignity, even in the face of evident hostility. and felt a wave of pride for her courage. Catherine, addressing the guests directly, stated that the truth was they had voluntarily redistributed a small fraction of the excessive wealth of that region to families facing starvation and despair. Every item they stole, she explained, fed children, warmed cold homes, or provided essential medical care. Alexandra added that every family they helped represented their moral failure to adequately fulfill their duties as leaders of society. Lord Ashford, as host, tried to restore some order to the event, but it was evident that the night had irrevocably transformed into something far beyond a common social scandal. Several ladies had fainted at the revelation, servants watched nervously from the perimeter of the ballroom, and some guests began to leave precipitously. Sir Edmund Blackthorne, who had been secretly summoned by one of the alarmed guests, addressed the Duke of Rothwell, stating that in the name of public order, he must request his surrender to the competent authorities, as his confessions that night constituted an admission of serious crimes. Alexandra looked at Catherine, finding in her eyes the same quiet determination he had admired from the beginning. Together, they had managed to force the regional aristocracy to directly confront their own moral contradictions. Regardless of the personal consequences they would face, they had achieved their goal of exposing the systematic hypocrisy that allowed such social inequality. Alexandra responded with dignity to Sir Edmund, stating his complete acceptance of responsibility for his actions. However, he requested that Lady Catherine be treated as a victim of his undue influence, not as a willing criminal. Catherine firmly interjected, stepping forward, stating that she would not allow him to take sole responsibility for decisions they made together, asserting that she was as guilty as His Grace, and equally proud of their actions. The ballroom remained in tense silence as everyone processed the magnitude of what they had witnessed. It was not simply common crimes, but a philosophical and moral rebellion that challenged the very foundations of the established social order. Sir Reginald, still red with indignation, pointed accusingly at both of them. He declared that these criminals should be hanged for treason against their own class, stating that their actions encouraged insurrection and threatened the stability of their entire society. But Lady Margaret Ashford, observing the dignity with which Alexandra and Catherine faced their accusations, raised a trembling hand. She hesitantly suggested that perhaps they should consider whether their motivations, though incorrectly expressed, did not reveal real deficiencies in their administration of the less fortunate. It was a courageous observation that some guests supported with murmurs of agreement, while others rejected it with indignation. The ballroom clearly divided between those who saw Alexandra and Catherine as dangerous criminals and those who began to question whether their actions revealed uncomfortable truths about their own moral negligence. When the authorities arrived to make the arrests, Alexandra and Catherine walked together towards the exit. Their hands briefly intertwined in a final gesture of unity. They had managed to plant seeds of doubt and reflection that would flourish regardless of their personal fate. 18 months after the dramatic night at Ashford Manor, the small rural estate in the Scottish hills offered a serene view that deeply contrasted with the storm of controversies that had transformed the Rothwell region. Alexandra, now simply Mr. Cameron, having irreversibly lost his ducal title, watched from the window of his modest home as Catherine organized correspondence arriving daily from all over England. The trial had been a public spectacle that divided British society's opinion. Alexandra's full confession, and the eloquent defense they both presented of their motivations, transformed what should have been a common criminal trial into a national debate about aristocratic responsibility and social justice. Although they avoided imprisonment due to the intervention of influential sympathizers and growing public pressure, the social consequences were definitive and irreversible. Catherine, holding up an envelope with the family seal, announced a letter from Lord Pemberton, stating that he wrote of implementing significant wage increases for all workers on his properties and establishing a permanent fund for medical assistance. Alexandra turned, smiling with the genuine satisfaction such news always brought him. His loss of title and property had been painful, but the impact of their actions continued to reverberate in ways that validated their sacrifices. He then inquired about Sir Reginald. Catherine replied with a smile mixing irony and satisfaction that, ironically, he had become one of the region's most zealous social reformers, adding that their public exposure of his practices seemed to have forced him to confront aspects of his character he preferred to ignore. The transformation of some of his former aristocratic peers into advocates for social reforms had been an unexpected but gratifying consequence of their scandal. The social pressure created by their revelations forced many members of the aristocracy to reevaluate their own practices, resulting in genuine improvements in working conditions and assistance to the needy throughout the region. Catherine approached the window where Alexandra remained, and he instinctively put his arm around her waist, a gesture of domestic intimacy that had become natural during months of shared exile. She asked if he regretted it, a question they periodically asked each other, never certain of the answer they would receive. Alexandra honestly admitted to occasionally regretting losing his title and property, but never the life they had built together. Their current existence was materially modest, but emotionally rich in ways his previous aristocratic life had never provided. They worked together managing a small school for rural children, funded by donations from sympathizers who had been inspired by their story. Alexandra found himself genuinely satisfied, teaching literature and philosophy to young minds, whose curiousness reminded him of his own intellectual transformation. Catherine, opening another envelope, announced a letter from Lady Margaret, who wrote that the Society for Practical Christian Charity they had established as a model had already been replicated in 12 different counties. The organization they had created as an alternative to traditional aristocratic charity institutions had become their most lasting legacy. Based on principles of direct assistance and practical needs assessment, it eliminated the lengthy bureaucracies that often prevented aid from reaching those who needed it most. Alexandra watched Catherine read the correspondence, noting how the months had softened the lines of tension on her face. The constant vigilance and risk that had characterized her life as a clandestine redistributor had been replaced by the satisfaction of open and legitimate work for social good. She then mentioned a letter from his cousin Charles, hesitating slightly before continuing, stating that the new Duke of Rothwell, his young nephew, had expressed interest in learning about the administrative methods he had developed there. The mention of his old title always brought a pang of melancholy. Alexandra had grown up expecting the duchy would eventually pass to his own children, but his forced renunciation ensured the direct lineage was broken. However, knowing that his nephew sought to implement progressive reforms, partially eased that loss. Alexandra, after a moment of reflection, suggested inviting him for a visit, believing that if he was genuinely interested in responsible social administration, their experience there could be valuable. Catherine smiled, recognizing in the suggestion the same practical idealism that had motivated their original actions. She then asked about their own family, lightly touching her abdomen where a pregnancy, still in its early weeks, was beginning to manifest. Alexandra knelt beside her chair, gently placing his hand over hers. The discovery that they would have a child had brought a completely new dimension to their reflections on the future. He told her that their child would grow up understanding that true nobility did not derive from inherited titles, but from actions that honored human dignity, asserting it would be a different inheritance from the one he received, but infinitely more valuable. Catherine leaned in to kiss his forehead, a gesture that carried all the tenderness that had blossomed between them during months of shared adversity. She asked, what if their child questioned why they abandoned a life of privilege and security? Alexandra replied that they would say they discovered a clear conscience was worth more than all the riches they could ever possess, and that true love grew best in the soil of shared moral conviction. As the sun set over the Scottish hills, painting the sky in golden hues that rivaled any aristocratic salon Alexandra had ever known, both understood that they had found a form of happiness that transcended the social conventions that had once governed their lives. Their story had become legend in the region they left behind, the narrative of the Duke who renounced everything for love and justice, and of the extraordinary woman who inspired him to discover his true nature. Letters regularly arrived from young aristocrats questioning their own roles in society, from grateful workers for the improvements their actions had inspired, and from social reformers seeking guidance on practical methods of effective assistance. Catherine, organizing the letters for response, remarked that she believed they had achieved something she never imagined possible when she began her solitary crusade. Alexandra asked what that was. She replied that they had proven that genuine social change did not require violent revolution, but sometimes merely required privileged people to have enough courage to act according to their moral convictions, regardless of personal consequences. Alexandra nodded, understanding that Catherine had articulated the true meaning of everything they had been through. They were not heroes in the traditional sense, but rather individuals who had consciously chosen a difficult path because they believed it was the right one. That night, as they prepared for bed in their modest but cozy home, Alexandre reflected on how his definition of wealth had completely transformed. True prosperity, he understood, did not reside in titles or property, but in the peace that came from living according to consciously chosen principles. His ducal title was lost forever, but he had gained something far more valuable: a life built on solid moral foundations, a love born of mutual admiration and shared purpose, and the satisfaction of knowing that his actions had created lasting positive changes in the world. The echo of his old title still occasionally resonated in his mind, but now it sounded less like a regrettable loss, and more like the distant echo of a life he had completely surpassed. Mr. Cameron was an infinitely more complete and satisfied man than the Duke of Rothwell had ever been. And so, as the Scottish winter approached, and Catherine planned the education of their unborn child, both understood that they had discovered the rarest form of happy ending, one that had cost them everything they materially possessed, but had provided them with everything that truly mattered spiritually.